The movie begins with a guy named Bernie telling his friend Danny about a fun adventure he had with a feisty 20-year-old. He said she approached him while he was at his former job and asked him to follow her to her room to pick up her credit card. Bernie says he followed her into her room, and then she says she'd like to take a quick shower, which she invites him to join. This story sounds like something from an adult video, but it really cracks Danny up. Bernie narrates the story to Danny until they get on a train and get to a pub named Mother's. The next day, Bernie and Danny go play baseball. Some women named Joan and Debbie watch the boys play nearby. They all notice Bernie and Danny, who are dominating the other team, and they gauge their level of hotness. Debbie goes to get some beer for the other girls, and Danny offers to help fetch her drink and flirts with her when Bernie and Danny win. Debbie approaches one of the members of the losing team, her boss Steve, whom she asks to meet with that night at her mother as Steve tells her he isn't free, and Joan comes to tell her how auditors told her that she's dating her boss that night. Debbie and Joan head to Mother's to cool off while Bernie and Danny go celebrate their victory. Danny and Debbie keep exchanging glances while Bernie is speaking to Danny when Debbie attempts to leave. Danny goes to meet her. He tells her directly that he noticed that they've been exchanging glances, but she jokes that she was checking the clock over his head. They both smile at each other later. Danny takes Debbie home, and they listen to some music together. The air soon gets danced, and they start to make out. After they're done, Debbie tries to escape while Danny sleeps. He catches her trying to leave and offers her a ride, but she tells him there's no need to. Debbie gets home and finds Joan outside her room. Joan excitedly tells her that the guy she brought home is really big and she has no space to sleep on the bed. They both laugh it off. Does she mean he's fat or that his eggplant is big? The next morning, Bernie and Danny talk about their scores from last night. Their boss, Fovio, soon approaches them with some paperwork, and they immediately pretend to be on the phone when Fovio leaves. Danny places a call to Debbie, who tells him that last night was a fluke because she was really drunk. He invites her out that night, but she refuses. When Steve approaches her, she tries to hang up, but Danny tells her to meet him at Mother's that night. Steve apologizes to Debbie for how he acted last night. He asks her if she's free at night, but she says she's busy. Debbie later calls Joan to tell her about her date with Danny, and Joan decided to follow her as a chaperone that night. Bernie and Danny wait for the girls to come for a double date. When they step in, Bernie immediately approaches Debbie and compliments her beauty while totally ignoring Joan. When Danny tells him who is who, Bernie tries to speak to Joan, but she decides to leave the pub out of anger. Bernie decides to head home and leave the lovers. Danny and Debbie start talking, and she tells him not to get any ideas because nothing is going to happen this night. Moments later, they're together on the bed after some fun. They joke about some things, and he asks her to spend the night, which she does over the course of the next few days. Debbie and Danny go on several dates, and they seem to be falling in love. He takes her to his regular coffee shop, and they have a nice time. He asks the shop owner, Gus, for a refill, but Gus tells him to go get it himself. Danny jokingly tells him he's getting in the way of him impressing his girl, but Gus tells him he shouldn't have brought her there. Then they both start to miss work once in a while, and their bosses notice they both start to miss appointments with their best friends too. While Danny and Debbie walk, he tells her of his plans to open a restaurant. When Debbie returns home, she finds an angry Joan who chastises her for missing their outing at the spa and not telling her where she went. Debbie apologizes. Joan tells her they didn't become this close by leaving each other when every random guy shows up. They both decide to make up the next morning. Danny reports to work and his boss hears him a new one for missing work. While he smacks the behind of one of the workers, Mrs. Lyons, on the bus, Bernie learns that Danny has been seeing Debbie. Danny tells him he's called her twice this week, and he exclaims that you never call abroad more than once a week. Meanwhile, Joan tells Debbie that Danny is most likely sleeping with someone else since he hasn't called her in 3 days after some fun with Steve. Debbie confesses to him that she can no longer keep seeing him because she's seeing someone else. She goes to Danny's home late at night and wakes him up. She tells him she came to tell him she's fine in case he wondered, and he apologizes by saying he should have called. She tells him not to say that to make her feel better, and he invites her in. She refuses by telling him she's not such an easy catch, but he asks her to just step in for a minute. Not long after, they are seen in the room and then in the bathtub. He tells her he loves her and loves making love with her, and she does the same sometime later. Danny tells Debbie to get a drawer for her underwear since she always comes around. She realizes he's asking her to move in with him, so she asks him if he's sure, which he affirms. Later, Debbie tells Joan that Danny asked her to move in with him, and Joan appears disturbed the next day. Danny and Bernie show up at Joan's place to help her move out, but Danny keeps getting into arguments with Joan over little things. Bernie helps them move their stuff, and he plays with some of Debbie's underwear while doing it. Debbie tries to find space for her things in the new place, and Danny tries to deal with how he moves his things around when they're done arranging. Danny gets a call from his ex-girlfriend while Debbie is there. He tries to tell Debbie that it's all in the past, but she tells him they're living together now and they can't afford to take their relationship lightly. They get into a short argument, but he calms her down and promises they'll make the most of living together the next morning at work. Bernie warns Danny about his relationship with Debbie while they check out their hot new co-worker. Bernie wants him to be careful since he doesn't know where she's been, but he eventually agrees that it's Danny's business friend who is on his way to have lunch with Mrs. Lyons, and tells Danny to cut gas off their credit subscription. Danny tries to convince Gus begs him to reconsider since his father left him the place. Danny goes to meet Gus to break the bad news and averts looking at him. Danny goes home and meets Debbie, who is repainting the place. She notices his gloomy face and asks him if he's fine, and he says he is. He asks her if she's fine, and she says the same. The next day, Danny walks in on Debbie while she's going through some of his old photos and snooping through his things. She apologizes, but he tells her it's okay. She soon starts to cry about how it's not okay, but she had to snoop through his things because she wanted to know more about him. She starts to express her worry that they're not close enough and don't know what's on each other's minds, so he assures her they can work on it. They start doing more things together over the next couple of weeks. One night after they have an incredible romp session, they both tell each other they love one another later at work. Bernie is surprised when he learns Danny has used the L word with Debbie. When Danny gets home, he finds Debbie trying to hide a pregnancy kit. He acts so worried, and she tells him she's not pregnant but wanted to be sure. He notices she looks sad and asks if she was disappointed by his reaction. She tries to hide it, but later agrees that she was a little bit disappointed even though she isn't ready to have a baby the next day. Danny gets into a big argument with Fabio because he didn't cut off Gus, and Danny leaves work at home. Debbie tries to comfort him by saying he can finally go to his restaurant since she'll help with footing the bills, but that doesn't make him feel better. Bernie comes to tell Danny that Fabio wants him back at work, and he asks him if Debbie's the one putting pressure on him to leave. Danny starts an argument, and they curse at each other for a bit. Bernie confesses that he misses him and leaves. Danny goes to Gus's restaurant to finally let him go, and Gus thanks him for doing all he could at home. Debbie meets an angry Danny. She tries to show him a design, but he starts to complain about how the room looks. She asks him if she offended him, and he tells her he's angry because he went back to his boss with his tail between his legs. She tries to comfort him, but he asks to be left alone. He finds out that she made a design for his future restaurant, which makes him feel bad. On Thanksgiving Day, Debbie and Danny both get into an argument about who did more work preparing for Thanksgiving, and they also express how much they don't like each other's friends. Bernie and Joan soon arrive, and they have dinner. While in the kitchen, Debbie doesn't tell Gary about Gary, who really likes her and whom she wants to get serious with. The next morning, Danny and Debbie get into another argument. Danny brings up the topic of her past relationship with Steve, which she never told him about, so she decides to leave the house. He tries to follow her out but eventually realizes he's locked out while in his towel. Debbie goes to Joan's home. She tells Joan she feels like she and Danny are acting like children and she didn't know it would go like this eventually. She meets Gary, who tells her that Danny will come around. She decides not to sleep over there, and she returns home. She finds Danny on the couch after he must have slept off waiting for her. She wakes him up and they hug on Christmas Day. Joan reads a story about Jesus' birth to her kindergarten kids. They ask her who a virgin is and she tells them, and then they ask her if she's won at the Christmas party at Danny's work. Bernie tries to hook him up with Common, but Danny doesn't budge. Meanwhile, at Debbie's workplace Christmas party, Steve tries to seduce her again, but she tells him to stop. She tells him she's in love with Danny and wants to have his babies. He decides to back off and apologizes. When Daniel arrives, he almost gets into a fight with Steve when Debbie introduces them. While Danny and Debbie head home, they both keep silent until they go to sleep. Winter begins, and they both decide to stay home and continue a boring routine. On New Year's Eve, Debbie cooks a nice dinner for herself and Danny. Danny gets a call from Benny, who invites him to Mother's Day, but he ignores it. Debbie decides that they should head out since it's boring to be at home. They soon get to meet their mothers and all their friends. Bernie and Danny start talking, but Common comes to ask for a dance with Danny. Bernie goes to chuck some bear while Danny and Carmen head to a secluded place. Carmen asks Danny for a New Year's kiss, and he decides to give her one. Debbie glances over and spots Carmen and Danny in a Titan race. She's shocked, but soon has to go attend to Joan, who just screamed. Debbie approaches Joan, who tells her to leave her alone. Debbie apologizes for not always being around and pesters her till she talks. Joan tells her that Gara just broke up with her because he's getting back together with his wife and he never told her he was married. Debbie goes to tell Danny she has to take Joan home, but Danny, who is already drunk with Bernie, tells her to put her in the cab because Joan always does this to try to hook her down. Debbie tells them they're both horses and takes Joan home. When Debbie returns home, she finds Danny waiting for her. Seated on the couch, he starts to tell her his sorry things didn't work out between them. She asks him when the spark started to die for him, and he tells her not to read too much meaning into things. She asks him if she was just a great sport for him, and he tells her he just doesn't love her anymore and he wants her to move out. Debbie starts to cry and leaves. The next day, she comes to pack out her stuff while Danny watches her. He tries to ask her if she's all right, but she tells him she doesn't want to see him again. Debbie moves back in with Joan while Danny and Bernie resume their usual goal hunting over the next few weeks. Danny keeps making love to several women. Eventually, he gets another girl home but apologizes that he can't go on with it because he's thinking about someone else. Bernie almost loses it when he hears that he left the girl from last night hanging because of Debbie. The next day, Danny calls Debbie to apologize and tell her that he's not been able to work or do anything because he misses her. She tells him she never wants to hear from him again. That night, he finds her at her mother's house and publicly declares to her that he loves her. He steps outside and follows her to tell her the same thing again. She tells him to move on with his life. Danny takes the walk of shame and walks by Gus's closed restaurant that night. Debbie cries while Joan comforts her. The next day, Danny goes to quit his job. He finds Gus and asks for permission to renovate the restaurant. Gus agrees, and they renovate the place together. That night, Bernie brings some antique cups to her for Danny's restaurant collection, and Danny thanks him. Bernie congratulates him and says Daniel will probably soon get married and have kids, then his wife will divorce him and take all his money sometime later. Bernie and Danny go play some baseball while they check out some ladies. Debbie and Joan ride their bicycles nearby, and Danny locks eyes with Debbie. They wave at each other while their friends tell them it's a bad idea. Debbie goes to talk with Danny while Bernie insists on chaperoning the discussion. Danny asks Barney to give them some space, and he does. They both apologize to each other about how awful things went, and Danny tells her their time together was the best time of his life. He asks her out to dinner sometime, and she agrees after she walks away. Benny sends Danny away because of the smug look on his face. Danny decides to chase down Debbie's bike while Bernie unsuccessfully hits on Joan. What did you guys think of this movie? I couldn't stand Benny, he had the audacity to be so cocky when he'd be looking like that. Hopefully they lived happily ever after. Subscribe for more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like. It really helps the channel.